The morning sun was just peeking through the airport's massive windows as a small figure clutched her favorite stuffed pilot bear, standing in line at the check-in counter. Little Amy Chen, just 8 years old, could barely keep still, her heart racing with excitement. This wasn't just any ordinary day. It was her very first time flying alone to visit her dad in New York. "Remember everything we talked about?" her mom asked, kneeling down to straighten Amy's special airplane-printed dress, the one she'd specifically chosen for this big day. Amy nodded eagerly, her pigtails bouncing. She'd been counting down the days, marking them off on her calendar with bright star stickers. "I remember, Mom. Keep my documents in the blue folder, stay with the airline staff, and don't talk to strangers," she recited proudly, hugging her bear named Captain Whiskers even tighter. The bear, slightly worn from years of love, wore a tiny pilot's hat that Amy's dad had given her on her last birthday. The check-in agent smiled warmly at Amy, noticing how she stood on her tiptoes to peek over the counter. "Well, look whom we have here. Are you our special passenger today?" she asked, her kind voice immediately putting both Amy and her mom at ease. Amy beamed, showing the gap where she'd recently lost her front tooth. "I'm going to be a pilot just like my daddy," Amy announced, her eyes sparkling with determination. "This is my first time flying in first class." The agent's smile grew wider as she processed the tickets and attached special tags to Amy's small rainbow-colored suitcase. While they waited, Amy couldn't stop talking about airplanes. She knew all kinds of facts: how planes stay in the air, what all the different parts were called, and even what those funny lines on the runway meant. Her mom listened patiently, having heard these facts countless times before, but still enjoying her daughter's enthusiasm. A friendly airline staff member named Rose arrived to escort Amy through security. "Your chariot awaits, future captain," Rose said with a playful bow, making Amy giggle. The goodbye was a mix of excitement and tears, mostly from Mom, who tried to hide them behind her smile. "You're going to have the best time, sweetie," Mom said, giving Amy one last hug. "Dad's so excited to see you. Don't forget to wave to the pilot. You never know. It might be someone special." She winked, sharing a secret moment with her daughter. As they walked through the airport, Amy clutched her documents folder in one hand and Captain Whiskers in the other. Rose kept her entertained by pointing out different planes through the windows, helping Amy identify each one. "Look at that big one over there," Amy exclaimed, pointing at a massive aircraft. "That's a Boeing 777. Did you know it has 2 engines that are as big as my whole bedroom?" Going through security was like an adventure game. Amy had to put Captain Whiskers through the X-ray machine, watching nervously until he emerged on the other side. "See? Even Captain Whiskers needs to follow airport rules," Rose explained, making the whole process feel less intimidating. At the gate, Amy sat swinging her legs on the big airport chairs, watching as other passengers began to gather. She overheard bits of their conversations: business people talking on phones, families discussing vacation plans, and students heading back to school. Each person had their own story, but Amy was sure none were as exciting as hers. When it was finally time to board, Amy stood up straight and tall, just like her dad had taught her. She was going to be brave and grown up about this whole thing. As she walked down the jet bridge, she imagined herself as a real pilot, already planning how she'd greet her own passengers someday. The first-class cabin looked magical to her young eyes. The big, comfy seats, the soft lighting, and the friendly smiles from some of the passengers. Amy clutched her bear tightly, whispering to him, "We made it, Captain Whiskers. Our first real flight adventure." Little did Amy know that this flight would become much more than just her first solo journey. As she settled into her seat by the window, watching the ground crew moving around outside, she had no idea that the next few hours would turn into a story that people would talk about for years to come. A story about courage, dignity, and the unexpected ways life teaches its most important lessons. Amy had just settled into her first-class seat, carefully placing Captain Whiskers next to the window so he could watch the planes too. The leather seat felt huge around her small frame, and she couldn't help but smile as she discovered all the exciting buttons on the armrest. Her feet barely touched the floor, but she felt like a proper grown-up traveler. The cabin started filling up with other passengers, business people in suits, a couple dressed for vacation, and an elderly lady who gave Amy a warm smile as she passed by. Amy returned the smile shyly, clutching her blue document folder just like her mom had taught her. Everything was going perfectly until Flight Attendant Rita Brooks stepped into her row. Rita's perfectly pressed uniform and tight bun gave her an intimidating appearance, but it was the cold look in her eyes that made Amy's smile fade slightly. The flight attendant stopped abruptly, her eyes narrowing as she looked between Amy and the seat number. There must be some mistake, Rita announced loudly, her voice carrying across several rows. She didn't even address Amy directly, instead looking around as if expecting to find this child's actual seat somewhere else. This is the first-class cabin. Amy's small hands trembled slightly as she reached for her blue folder. I have my ticket right here, she said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady, just like her dad had taught her. She pulled out the carefully organized documents her mom had prepared. Rita barely glanced at the documents before shaking her head. These need to be verified, she declared, her voice dripping with skepticism. It's unusual to have certain passengers in first class. The way she emphasized certain made Amy's cheeks burn red. Other passengers began to look over, some with concern, others with curiosity. Amy felt herself shrinking into the large seat, wishing she could disappear. Captain Whiskers slipped from the window seat onto the floor, and Rita deliberately stepped over the stuffed bear without picking it up. Your dress is hardly appropriate for first class, Rita continued, eyeing Amy's beloved airplane print dress with clear disapproval. We have standards to maintain. Each word felt like a tiny pin pricking Amy's excitement, deflating it bit by bit. A businessman across the aisle buried his head deeper in his newspaper, pretending not to notice. Two ladies a few rows ahead turned to whisper to each other, throwing glances in Amy's direction. The elderly lady who had smiled earlier frowned deeply at Rita, but hadn't yet spoken up. Perhaps we should move you to economy class, Rita suggested with a false sweetness that didn't match her cold eyes. You might feel more comfortable there. She emphasized the word comfortable, in a way that made it clear she wasn't thinking about Amy's comfort at all. Amy's lower lip trembled as she tried to hold back tears. She wanted to be brave, to show everyone she could handle flying alone, but Rita's words stung deeply. She thought about her dad, about how proud he would be of her for making this trip. She couldn't let him down by crying. My daddy says I'm allowed to sit here, Amy managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. She reached down to rescue Captain Whiskers from the floor, hugging him close for comfort. The bear's familiar softness gave her a tiny bit of courage. Rita's lips pressed into a thin line. Well, your daddy should know better than to put you in a situation like this. First class isn't the place for playing with toys. She picked up Amy's documents again, making a show of examining each page with exaggerated scrutiny. The air in the cabin felt heavy and uncomfortable. A few passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, while others pretended to be absorbed in their phones or magazines. The elderly lady began to gather her courage to speak up, her hands gripping her armrests tightly. What none of them knew, not the disapproving Rita, not the uncomfortable passengers, and especially not the people avoiding the scene, was that this situation was about to take a very unexpected turn. As the final boarding call echoed through the plane, a series of events was about to unfold that would change everything, particularly for the flight attendant who thought she was simply maintaining her idea of standards. Amy held onto Captain Whiskers tighter, her dad's words echoing in her mind. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay calm when others aren't. She had no way of knowing that her father's wisdom would prove especially meaningful in the next few moments. Rita wasn't done yet. She stood looming over Amy's seat, tapping her perfectly manicured nails against the blue folder containing Amy's travel documents. The sound seemed to echo through the first-class cabin, making Amy's heart beat faster with each tap. "Let's go through this one more time," Rita announced, her voice deliberately loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Your boarding pass, your identification, and your unaccompanied minor forms." She spread the papers across the empty seat next to Amy, making a show of examining each one as if searching for something wrong. Amy's small hands clutched Captain Whiskers tighter, her knuckles turning white. The bear's pilot hat was slightly crooked now, but she didn't dare adjust it, afraid to draw more attention to her beloved stuffed friend. Her excitement about flying had melted away like ice cream on a hot summer day. "You see," Rita continued, her tone dripping with fake sweetness, "first class has certain expectations. Certain standards." She gestured at Amy's airplane print dress again, then at Captain Whiskers. "This isn't some playground where children can just run around playing make-believe pilot." The elderly lady across the aisle couldn't stay quiet any longer. "Young lady," she called out to Rita, her voice warm but firm, "I've been flying first class for 30 years, and I've never seen such unprofessional behavior from a flight attendant." Rita's face tightened, but she kept her practiced smile. "Ma'am, I'm simply following protocol. We need to ensure everyone is in their proper place." She emphasized the word proper while giving Amy another disapproving look. A businessman lowered his newspaper slightly. "The child has a valid ticket," he pointed out quietly. "She's causing no disturbance." But Rita wasn't finished. She picked up Amy's carry-on bag, a small rainbow-colored suitcase, and started inspecting it. "This seems quite large for a child your size. We'll need to check if it meets our size requirements." She lifted the bag high, making Amy worry about the special drawings she'd made for her dad getting crumpled. Tears were now rolling down Amy's cheeks, but she tried to wipe them away quickly. Her mom had told her to be brave, and brave people didn't cry. But it was hard not to when Rita kept finding new ways to make her feel small and out of place. "Perhaps," Rita suggested with a cold smile, "we should review the safety procedures for unaccompanied minors." Again. She pulled out the safety card and began reading it loudly, as if Amy couldn't understand simple instructions. "Though I'm not sure someone who can't even dress appropriately for first class can handle emergency procedures." Other passengers were now openly watching the scene unfold. Some looked uncomfortable, others angry, and a few seemed embarrassed by the whole situation. A young woman in a business suit started recording the incident discreetly on her phone, her face showing clear disapproval of Rita's behavior. Amy's voice trembled as she tried one more time to stand up for herself. "My daddy says I'm supposed to sit here. He knows all about planes, and he says I'm allowed." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but she managed to get the words out. Rita's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Oh, sweetie, I'm sure your daddy means well, but this is a premium cabin. We can't have it turning into some kind of—" She paused, looking at Captain Whiskers with disdain, "children's playroom." The elderly lady had pulled out her phone and appeared to be typing an email to the airline's customer service. The businessman had fully lowered his newspaper now, watching the scene with growing concern. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. What nobody realized was that Carmo was about to serve a masterclass in humility. As the final preparations for takeoff were being made, a series of events was about to unfold that would wipe the smug smile right off Rita's face. Sometimes the biggest lessons come wrapped in the most unexpected packages, and this flight was about to become a teaching moment none of them would ever forget. Amy held onto her father's words in her heart. Being kind is always more important than being right. She didn't know it yet, but her dad's wisdom was about to be proven in the most dramatic way possible. The elderly lady, Mrs. Wong, had finally had enough. Setting aside her knitting needles with deliberate care, she stood up slowly but purposefully. Despite her small stature, there was something commanding about her presence as she faced Rita. "I've been watching you harass this child for the past 15 minutes," Mrs. Wong said, her voice gentle but firm. "When I was a school teacher for 40 years, I taught my students that bullying comes in many forms. What would you call your behavior right now?" Rita's practiced smile faltered for a moment. "Ma'am, I'm simply doing my job. Maintaining the standards of our premium cabin is part of my responsibilities." She straightened her uniform jacket, trying to regain her composure. "Standards?" Mrs. Wong raised an eyebrow. "I see a well-behaved child with proper documentation who happens to be wearing a charming dress with airplanes on it. Please explain to all of us what standards are being violated here." More passengers were beginning to speak up now. The businessman who had been hiding behind his newspaper finally folded it completely and cleared his throat. "I fly this route every week," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "I've seen children much more disruptive than this young lady, and they weren't questioned simply because of their designer clothes." Amy sat very still in her large first-class seat, hardly daring to breathe. Captain Whiskers remained clutched tightly in her arms as she watched the adults around her stand up for her. It reminded her of the time her dad had told her about air traffic controllers, how they helped guide planes safely through storms. Rita's face had turned an interesting shade of pink. "I'm simply following protocol for unaccompanied minors," she insisted, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Perhaps if her parents had chosen a more appropriate cabin class. "I've heard enough," interrupted a woman in a crisp business suit who had been quietly recording the incident. "I work in public relations, and I can tell you right now that this is exactly the kind of situation that goes viral on social media. Would you like me to share how you've been treating this child with your airline's corporate office?" The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted dramatically. What started as uncomfortable silence had transformed into a united front of passengers standing up against injustice. Even the flight attendant from economy class had paused during her preparation duties, watching the scene unfold with concern. "Maybe," suggested another passenger, a kind-faced man with salt and pepper hair, "we should speak to the head of cabin crew about this situation. I'm sure they'd be very interested in how their first-class passengers are being treated." Rita's professional mask began to crack slightly. She looked around the cabin, suddenly aware that she had lost control of the situation. The documents she had been so eagerly scrutinizing now felt heavy in her hands. Mrs. Wong wasn't finished yet. She moved to sit in the empty seat next to Amy, placing a gentle hand on the child's shoulder. "Sweetheart, would you like to tell us about that wonderful pilot bear you're holding? I bet there's a special story behind it." Amy looked up, surprised by the kindness in Mrs. Wong's voice. For the first time since Rita had started questioning her, she felt a small smile tugging at her lips. "His name is Captain Whiskers," she said softly. "My daddy gave him to me. He knows all about planes." The other passengers listened with genuine interest as Amy's confidence slowly returned. The business suit woman had stopped recording but kept her phone ready, just in case. The businessman nodded encouragingly, while other passengers smiled warmly at Amy's story. Rita stood awkwardly to the side, her authority diminishing with each passing moment. The flight was preparing for departure, and she knew she should be completing her pre-flight checks, but leaving now would feel like admitting defeat. What none of them knew was that the real turning point of this story was just moments away. As the final boarding call ended and the cabin crew prepared for departure, something was about to happen that would turn Rita's world upside down. Sometimes the biggest lessons in life come when we least expect them. And this flight was about to become legendary for all the right reasons. The plane's engines hummed to life as the final preparations for takeoff were being made. Rita had retreated to the galley, still flustered by the passengers' intervention, but trying to maintain her composure. The cabin had settled into an uneasy quiet, with Mrs. Wong still sitting protectively next to Amy. Then the cabin speakers crackled to life. The sound made everyone look up, expecting the usual pre-flight announcements. Instead, a warm, confident voice filled the cabin. "Good morning, everyone. This is your captain speaking. I'm Captain David Chen, and I'll be flying you to New York today. Weather conditions are perfect for flying, and we're expecting a smooth journey. Flight time today will be approximately 3 hours and 20 minutes. At the sound of the captain's voice, Amy's whole face lit up like a Christmas tree. She sat up straighter in her seat, squeezing Captain Whiskers with excitement. Mrs. Wong noticed the sudden change in the little girl's demeanor, but she wasn't the only one who saw it. Rita, who had emerged from the galley to begin the safety demonstration, froze mid-step. The color drained from her face as she watched Amy's reaction to the captain's voice. Something wasn't adding up. The captain continued, "And I'd like to extend a special welcome to a very important passenger today, my daughter, who's flying alone for the first time. I'd arranged my schedule specifically to be her pilot on this special journey." The cabin fell completely silent. Every head turned toward Amy, who was now beaming with pride. Rita's hands began to shake slightly as the realization hit her. The businessman across the aisle couldn't help but smile, while the woman in the business suit raised her eyebrows knowingly. "I've been a pilot for 15 years, the captain's voice continued warmly, "and nothing makes me prouder than sharing my love of aviation with my little girl, who dreams of becoming a pilot herself one day. She's wearing her favorite airplane dress today. Make sure to say hello if you see her." Rita's face had turned as white as her pressed uniform shirt. She looked at Amy's airplane print dress, the same one she had criticized so harshly, and then at the cabin ceiling speaker, as if hoping this was all a bad dream. Mrs. Wong patted Amy's hand gently. "Your father sounds like a wonderful pilot," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "No wonder you know so much about planes." The business suit woman couldn't resist adding, "And what a lovely airplane dress you're wearing. So appropriate for a future pilot, wouldn't you agree?" She directed this last comment straight at Rita, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the galley and never come out. The other passengers began to whisper among themselves, some shaking their heads at the irony of the situation. The kind-faced man with salt and pepper hair chuckled softly. "Well, it seems some people really should learn not to judge a book by its cover," he mused. Amy hugged Captain Whiskers closer, this time not out of fear, but pure joy. "That's my daddy," she said proudly to Mrs. Wong. "He promised he'd find a way to make my first flight special." The cabin crew's senior attendant, who had been informed of the situation, approached Rita with a stern expression. "We need to talk," she whispered firmly, gesturing for Rita to follow her to the galley. As Rita walked away, her shoulders slumped in embarrassment. The captain's voice came over the speaker one final time. "We'll be taking off in just a few minutes. And remember, everyone on this flight is a VIP in their own way. That's what makes air travel so magical. You never know who might be sitting next to you." The passengers broke into spontaneous applause, not just for the captain's words, but for the perfect way justice had been served. Amy sat up even taller in her seat, holding Captain Whiskers up to the window so he could see everything too. The story wasn't over yet, though. As the plane began to taxi toward the runway, everyone knew that the real moment of truth would come after landing, when Captain Chen would finally step out of the cockpit. Sometimes the best lessons in life come with a side of humble pie, and Rita's serving was just being warmed up. The landing in New York was smooth as silk. As the plane taxied to its gate, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin crackled with anticipation. Amy sat perfectly straight in her seat, Captain Whiskers propped up in her lap, both of them facing forward like proper aviation professionals. Rita had spent most of the flight hiding in the galley, emerging only when necessary for service, her usual confidence deflated like a balloon. The other flight attendants had taken over most of her duties, treating Amy with extra kindness that made Rita's earlier behavior stand out even more. As the seatbelt sign dinged off, nobody rushed to stand up. Even the busy-looking businessman stayed seated, his newspaper forgotten. Mrs. Wong kept knitting, but her eyes were fixed on the cockpit door. The woman in the business suit had her phone ready, though not recording, just in case it was needed again. The cockpit door opened with a soft click. Captain David Chen stepped out, his uniform crisp and professional, his captain's stripes gleaming under the cabin lights. He was younger than most passengers had imagined, with kind eyes and a warm smile that matched his voice. The same smile, everyone noticed, that Amy had been wearing when she first boarded. "Daddy." Amy's voice filled the cabin as she jumped up from her seat, still clutching Captain Whiskers. She ran straight into her father's open arms, and he lifted her up in a big hug, his captain's hat tilting slightly as she wrapped her arms around his neck. "There's my favorite co-pilot," he said warmly, fixing Captain Whiskers' little pilot hat that had gone crooked. "How was your first solo flight?" The cabin crew's senior attendant had appeared beside Rita, who looked like she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. "Captain Chen," the senior attendant said formally, "might we have a word?" Captain Chen set Amy down gently. "Of course," he said, his voice professional but firm. "Mrs. Wang, would you mind watching my little aviator for a moment?" The elderly lady nodded, patting the seat next to her. The captain led Rita and the senior attendant to the galley area. Despite the closed curtain, everyone could hear his calm, measured voice. "I understand there was some confusion about my daughter's seating assignment earlier." Rita's voice trembled as she responded, though the words were muffled. The senior attendant's voice was clear. "Captain, I want to assure you this behavior does not reflect our airline's values." "No," Captain Chen agreed, his voice still steady. "It doesn't. And I'm not speaking as a captain right now, but as a father. Every passenger on this aircraft deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Every single one. The size of their wallet, the color of their skin, or the clothes they wear. None of that matters at 35,000 feet. Or on the ground." There was a pause, followed by what sounded like a shaky apology from Rita. Captain Chen continued, "I arranged to pilot this flight because I wanted my daughter's first solo journey to be special. Instead, it became a lesson in handling unkindness with grace. She's 8 years old. She should never have had to learn that lesson today." The business suit woman nodded in approval, while other passengers tried to pretend they weren't listening to every word. Amy sat with Mrs. Wang, showing her how Captain Whiskers' pilot hat could spin around, completely unaware of the important conversation happening behind the curtain. However, Captain Chen's voice softened slightly. "This can be a learning moment for everyone. My daughter wants to be a pilot someday. When that day comes, I hope she remembers not the unkindness she faced, but the way other passengers stood up for what was right." The curtain opened, and Captain Chen emerged, his professional demeanor intact. Rita followed, her eyes downcast, but her posture suggesting someone who had just received an important life lesson. The senior attendant looked satisfied with how things had been handled. As the other passengers began to gather their belongings, many stopped to shake Captain Chen's hand or pat Amy on the shoulder. The businessman finally folded his newspaper and smiled. "Best flight I've had in years," he commented to no one in particular. Amy ran back to her father, who scooped her up again. "Ready to go home, co-pilot?" he asked, adjusting her airplane dress that had gotten slightly wrinkled during the flight. "Yes, Daddy," she beamed, then turned to wave at Mrs. Wang. "Thank you for being my flight friend." As they walked off the plane together, Amy riding on her father's shoulders with Captain Whiskers safely tucked under her arm, the other passengers couldn't help but smile. Sometimes the biggest lessons in life come in the smallest packages, and today, a little girl in an airplane dress had taught everyone about dignity, grace, and the importance of standing up for what's right. The story of what happened on that flight didn't end at the airport that day. News travels fast in the aviation community, and within weeks, the incident had sparked important conversations about treating all passengers with respect and dignity. The airline's CEO, personally reached out to Captain Chen and Amy to apologize for their experience. But instead of demanding punishment, Captain Chen suggested something different. "Let's turn this into a chance to make things better," he said during a meeting with airline executives. "Every difficult moment can become an opportunity for positive change." Taking his words to heart, the airline launched a new training program called Wings of Respect. Rita, who had been deeply affected by the experience, became one of its strongest supporters. Her encounter with Amy had changed her perspective completely. "I learned more about being a flight attendant from an 8-year-old girl than I had in years of training," Rita admitted during a staff meeting. "She showed me that true first-class behavior has nothing to do with what you wear or how much your ticket costs." 6 months later, at a special airline event, Amy stood proudly next to her father, still wearing her favorite airplane dress, though she'd grown enough to need a new one. Captain Whiskers sat in the front row, sporting a fresh pilot's hat. The audience listened intently as Captain Chen shared their story with new flight crew members. "My daughter taught all of us something that day," he said, his hand resting gently on Amy's shoulder. "She showed us that sometimes our biggest teachers come in the smallest packages." The airline made significant changes to their unaccompanied minor program. They created special training sessions where experienced pilots, including Captain Chen, helped flight attendants understand the importance of making every young traveler feel safe and welcome. Mrs. Wang kept in touch with the Chen family, sending Amy postcards from her travels around the world. The business suit woman who had recorded the incident never needed to share the video. Instead, she became a regular speaker at airline customer service seminars, telling the story of how a group of strangers came together to stand up for what was right. 1 year later, Amy received a special surprise on her 9th birthday. The airline had created a junior pilot program, inspired by her story, to help young aviation enthusiasts learn about flying. They asked her to be the first participant, and she accepted with the biggest smile anyone had ever seen. Rita underwent a remarkable transformation too. She requested to work specifically with unaccompanied minors, becoming known as the flight attendant who went above and beyond to make children feel special. She kept a small pilot bear pin on her uniform, a reminder of the lesson she learned that day. The businessman who had witnessed everything became a regular on Captain Chen's flights. He often shared the story with his seatmates, especially when he saw young passengers boarding. "You see that, Captain," he would say. "He taught everyone that leadership isn't about authority. It's about turning difficult moments into chances for change." 3 years after that memorable flight, Amy stood in front of her school class, giving a presentation about Career Day. She wore her pilot's shirt proudly as she explained what she wanted to be when she grew up. Captain Whiskers sat on her desk, his pilot's hat a little worn but still proud. "My dad always says that the sky belongs to everyone," she told her classmates. "It doesn't matter what you look like or what you wear. What matters is how you treat people and how brave you are when things get tough." The story became a legend in the airline industry, shared during training sessions and company meetings. It wasn't just about a flight attendant who learned a lesson or a captain who stood up for his daughter. It was about how one small moment of prejudice was transformed into a wave of positive change. Today, if you fly with that airline, you might notice something special. Every unaccompanied minor receives a little pilot bear pin, along with a card that reads, "Welcome aboard, future aviator. The sky's the limit when you treat others with kindness." And somewhere up there, Captain Chen still flies the friendly skies, with a picture of Amy and Captain Whiskers in his cockpit. His daughter's dream of becoming a pilot grows stronger every day, fueled not by the memory of unkindness, but by the warmth of strangers who stood up for what was right.